Okay.
That's a long pause, you must be thinking. The architects have, like a lot of designers, I suspect, have some difficulty defining design as an activity. So lots of what we do when we present ourselves to the outside world is, look, Ma, what I did, right? Sort of stand up and there's this artifact, there's this thing. And we are notoriously bad at what we call post-occupancy evaluation, which is going back to buildings after people are in them and saying, how'd we do? So we have some difficulty fitting into the sort of science-y notions of progress through knowledge acquisition based on empirical evidence in a feedback pattern. And yet we do design. So there's something that goes on. We're anxious about our institutional place in terms of sort of feeling like we belong here, right? So we use the phrase, in fact, the faculty code includes the notion of creative productivity as equivalent to research in this institution. And we lean fairly heavily on that notion institutionally to explain ourselves. So design, in a sense, is almost inevitably a pointillist activity. It's not something that informs itself very well. It's not, we always talk about iteration in the context of design, but that's sort of within the point, not between points necessarily. Although individuals have careers that span some period of time. But, so I've been trying to think about this question in terms of how it relates to my notion of what we do as a flavor of designer. And in particular, as I direct the Master of Science program in architecture in design computing, so we're actually looking at tools and uses that are intentionally reflective about the designers who are in the professional domain. So that is another level of remove, or another mirror in the reflection pattern. And I think there's a couple of ways in which this manifests that might be relevant. And one is simply that we look fairly hard at the relationship between tools, and largely in our case digital tools, and design as a cognitive activity, and wonder about the ways in which the tools we have influence the designs we make, and the degree to which the tools get in the way, the tools change the culture. There are, I had a chairman, he's no longer here, so I can say this, who was convinced that postmodernism was a byproduct of AutoCAD, that there was a kind of direct relationship between that particular tool and the fascination that architects had for a while in the 80s and 90s with Drive It and making buildings that look like that. So we're sensitive to that notion and the possibility that by making better tools, we could make better buildings, because the ultimate goal is that we could go do post-occupancy evaluation and not be embarrassed, which is all too often the case these days. But I also was thinking about design at a small scale in terms of the kind of academic activity that people in our program, which is only about an 18-month-long program, usually manifest. There's a strong emphasis on prototyping, on sort of production of things that work in some sense. And I was thinking about that in contrast to how easy it is to get lost in the swamps of theory, where you're just kind of putting up ideas and floating them around, but not necessarily trying to construct out of that collection of ideas something that could be thought of as a proposition for action in the world. And prototypes come in lots of different flavors. They're not always physical, but they, like designs, frequently have their roots that start at the present reality, extend across some set of proposed changes, and end at some hypothetically better future reality, right? And that, in some sense, that's one of the other ways that design informs the kind of work that we do, and that we try to get students to do as part of their MS program. I'll put there.
So, Vachia's our discussant, so we'll bring her in as we begin discussing. But before we move on to well, I'll give you a chance to voice whether or not you want to jump in to just do a
No, we
intro.
can keep
You want to do it this way? Okay, so what I'd like to do is just open it up for questions really quickly and then jump back into our questions here. Does anyone have anything burning wants to follow up on? Any panelists want to follow up?
Can I hear some examples? So, I mean, I hear this word contextual a lot, and then, we don't have a context, so. Sorry.
No, I think it's a fair question. So, I can talk about I did a report project. I'm trying to decide which if I want to show something this time. I'll just talk. Okay, so the kind of work I do also sort of very actively oriented design. And I think the thing that resonates with me is this idea of a practice that's again highly localized, right? You're dealing with a very specific issue in a very specific place in a very specific moment, right? So the airport project, I can give you a specific example, was it was an installation in the city of San Jose, which is a city where you've got airplanes that are running kind of through. There was a proposal to expand one of the runways, which would have an impact on noise level pollution. And so I did an installation of these sound monitoring devices that were listening for airport noise, and then would place automated phone calls to the city's complaint on behalf of the residents of San Jose, in the voice of the people. And so it was a specific response to the architecture and geography of the city, and in response to a very particular kind of moment, right? There was this proposal on the table. And also it was a representation of the city, and that there were these characters who were presented through the audio recordings, right? So that's a, again, highly specific response. Now, when I think about the research component of that project, I think there are two ways I can talk about it. There is significant research that went into the project, right? So I had to understand something about San Jose, I had to understand the bond issue, or the proposal. I had to understand the different kinds of activist groups that were already on the ground.
Yeah.
I had to understand how information circulates in that environment. What does it mean to collect data, and where does that data go, right? It would have been very easy to collect information about sound pollution, make a big visualization somewhere, right? A museum perhaps, have people reflect on it somewhere. But I found that there was this particular mechanism in place where there is a complaint line the city operates, and they are required by law to report that data in the official record. So by making an intervention there, the data it was producing actually had life, right? It had some small impact because it became official data because it went through this channel. So that's all, very particular kinds of research. What that project also can do as a piece of research that's meant to inform the broader practice of art and design in this case are a couple of things. There were some technical things I did that were sort of interesting that I could share. The least of interesting, but that's in there, right? There was, it's a kind of a way of working, right? That for me and most of the scholarship that I do when I write papers and stuff, what I'm really interested in is the way that particular design practices shift when they move out of traditional commercial environments into other settings, whether those are activist or healthcare or something else. And so I'm able to talk about the kinds of techniques and methods that were used in that project and compare them to another sort of mainstream model of design practice. Okay? So the project itself can also function as a piece of research, but the claim I would make about that is that I don't have a desire or an expectation that the findings from that project are meant to be generalizable. I don't think that someone else should go and essentially do the same kind of project somewhere else, or even work in the same kind of way. It's meant more of a provocation, more of a way of establishing alternative perspectives, more of a way of contributing to something more like a culture of design criticism, right, which I do think is how we actually communicate with each other in design, rather than building a base of theory or, again, some notion of best practices or anything like that kind of thing. I think it's a different way of thinking, working, and sharing results. And I think it is distinct. And to your point, I think one of the things that we do struggle with, right, is how do we claim our place, right? How do we make the strong case while the work we do matters in some way? And I think we've had a long time of trying to do it in terms of science and engineering, and I don't think it works. I think we're much better off when we try to describe our work in terms of arts and humanities. I think it's a more natural fit, at least for the kind of work that we do very hard. So that would be good. That's
Yeah, I mean, were we going to sort of talk more about how we sort of feel about the relationship between the research and design, or are we going to go into more detail about, you know, a case study maybe, and sort of, so we have a, do we have time to do that?
We don't have much, but I mean, we can use the time as we want. I want to make sure that draw in some voices who've been thinking about, one of the themes in this class has been thinking about the relationship between theory and design. And so it's constantly part of the conversation around the scientizing of design as well. And that's something that Tad raised. I wonder if we can kind of move the discussion towards that question of how theory and design work end up entangling for the rest of the class here. Tad gave us a nice description of maybe these being different sort of projects, right? Anyone?
I'll pop into that for a moment. Because I have a crib net that sort of relates to that. And, yeah. Well, this is my brain. And I'll just read it because I think it says most of what I could say longer. Anyway, to act, we must plan. Now that's debatable to some extent, but let that stand for a moment. To plan is to design always with limited knowledge. In acting, we expand our knowledge. And then I would touch on in Don Norman's Poetics of Design, or the Design of Everyday Things, he has 7 stages of action, which I've found to be particularly informative when you look at it in terms of both sort of HCI-like activities and the general question of how do you decide what to do next, right? That you need to be able to have actionable kinds of behaviors that you can deploy in the world. So that we have to believe that there are objects you can pick up and manipulate, and that there are, activities that you can perform, and you have to have some idea of what the results of performing those activities is likely to be, or you can't very well interact with the universe. And that collection of things seems to me to be one way to see design as just an inevitable part of being human, which kind of spreads it out so thin, so what do you do next?
Well, what you might do is you might draw upon some of John Schum's theories of his epistemology of practice, where he lays out design as a cycle through taking action and then reflecting upon that action. And he creates a set of language around how you characterize the different kinds of moves that designers take when they work with materials, when they work within a design context. And being able to just describe what it is that people are doing with some precision, some rigor, is one first step towards using a theory within a practice situation.
That vocabulary is established through an interactive mentorship relationship. So it's sort of culturally defined and bounded in it.
I think it is, and it draws on the experience of the mentor, it draws on the materials that are present in the practice, and different contexts, I think, might have more specialized vocabulary, but I'm pretty sure that the idea that the materials are used to talk back to you, there's almost an agency of the materials, is present in any kind of context. So if you have a commitment towards design as artistry, then his theory helps us think about how it is that we construct these contexts so that we learn new things and that we understand what that would be addressing.